Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you here with us today. My name is Manuel Sanchez and I am the Regional Director for the U.S. Grains Council covering the Southeast Asia and Oceania regions. It is my great pleasure to kick off this morning's session today. Today's webinar will focus on decarbonization of transport fuel and the use of bioethanol to achieve this target. Over the next 2 hours, you will hear from a wide variety of experts who will talk about the latest information on the crucial role that ethanol holds in the long-term decarbonization of the transport fuel sector. Before you hear from our first speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping tips to help ensure that you could fully experience everything this virtual platform has to offer. At the bottom of your screen, you will see several icons. One of these icons is a translation widget. Simultaneous translation will be available in both Vietnamese and Bahasa Indonesia throughout the length of this virtual event. Feel free to select the language of your choice if you desire to use this translation option. Additionally, at the bottom of the screen, you should also note the Q&A widget. Please submit any questions you may have during the length of this webinar using this Q&A widget to ensure that we will answer these questions by one of the speakers at the end of this morning's session. Now, I want to introduce the following presenters who are delighted to speak to you all this morning. To start us off, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Mr. Levin Flake, Agricultural Counselor at the U.S. Office of Agricultural Affairs in Canberra, Australia. Before arriving in Australia, Levin served at the USDA office in Guangzhou, China, Moscow, Russia, and Lagos, Nigeria. In a few moments, you will also have the opportunity to hear from Ms. Shahana McKenzie, CEO of Bioenergy Australia. Shahana has a strong track record of driving public, government, and consumer campaigns for nonprofit sectors expanding over 15 years. She joined Bioenergy Australia in 2017 and is committed to driving growth in the bioenergy sector and advocating for bioenergy as a critical renewable energy solution for the future. Now let's hear it from Mr. Levin Flake.
Great, thank you, Manuel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to give some opening remarks today, as well as for the Grains Council and Bioenergy Australia for organizing this webinar. As you know, biofuels play an important part in U.S. agricultural and energy policy, as well as our environmental stewardship and sustainability efforts. Regarding the environmental benefits, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, has continued to stress these climate benefits of biofuels. And he has reiterated that blending fuel ethanol will continue to have a role to play in the U.S. transportation sector for a long time. And these environmental benefits are why the United States and a wide range of countries around the world mandate and encourage blending of biofuels in transportation fuel. Another positive aspect of biofuels is the continual technological improvement. For example, studies, including a recent one by the U.S. Department of Energy, continue to show that U.S. ethanol is becoming increasingly more efficient, and the carbon intensity of production continues to decrease relative to gasoline. The United States is also committed to expanding the infrastructure necessary to benefit from biofuels. In fact, the U.S. Department of Agriculture just announced increased funding to create the necessary infrastructure to expand the availability of higher blend renewable biofuels such as E15 and flex fuels. And of course, trade is a critical component of the U.S. biofuel strategy. The U.S. Department of Agriculture actively engages with governments throughout the world to expand global market access as well as remove restrictive trade barriers for both biofuels and biofuel feedstocks. And Australia, of course, is a major and global supplier of biofuel feedstocks such as canola and tallow. And in conclusion, as countries seek to amend their fuel standards and blending policies, USDA and our attaches around the world stand ready to assist governments and collaborate with industry in this mutually beneficial endeavor. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I very much look forward to the speakers during this webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Levin, and equally, I'm delighted to be here. As Manuel did say, I'm Shahana McKenzie, the CEO of Bioenergy Australia, and we are absolutely delighted to be partnering on the delivery of this event with the US Grains Council. And I would like to thank the US Grains Council as well as Manildra, who supported a really important report, which is going to be released today. So it is now available on our website, so I encourage everybody to check that out. But it will be spoken in more detail from a number of presenters today. So Bioenergy Australia, we are the industry association for Australia's future bioeconomy, and we really are leading the charge in terms of driving the development of Australia's bioeconomy. So if anybody out there that's watching this is interested in knowing more about how you can be developing projects in Australia, collaborating on projects, supporting Australian projects, we would really love to hear from you. In relation to the report that is being released today, that is now live, as I said, it is called Ethanol as Australia's Octane Enhancer, Implementation of the Aromatics Pool Reduction in Australia's Fuel Standards. And Keith and Bhavisha from TFA will be going into more detail in relation to that report. And that's a report that was commissioned by Bioenergy Australia off the back of the changes that were proposed and endorsed for Australia's fuel standards in 2017 that were eventually adopted in 2019. So we're really looking to inform that debate and ensure that ethanol is leveraged and harnessed as Australia's octane enhancer, and we really do feel that this report does provide a significant amount of information in order to be able to make some really positive decisions in that space that are informed with fact, which is great. So I suppose in terms of this fantastic webinar that we have taking place today, it is a global webinar. So we have 3 different countries represented in terms of speakers. And I'm delighted to say that this is the first time Australia has participated in a webinar which is actually being translated into a number of different languages. So we're delighted about that. We are going to have our moderator for the session that's taking place today is Jeff Bell. He is the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Microbiogen. He is also Australia's representative on the International Energy Agency Task 43, which is biorefining in a circular economy. He's our representative on that. And he is our go-to person for a lot of content relating to ethanol in Australia. He's fantastic. Our first presenters that are presenting from Australia, as I said, we have Keith Sharp. He's the Engineering Manager of TFA Project Group in Australia. And we have Bhavisha Kailashan, and she is, let me just check, the Chemical Process Engineer for TFA. And they both worked on the development of the report that will be released. After those, we then have Chris Bliley, who is the Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Growth Energy USA. And he will be speaking to ethanol, the 21st century fuel for the 21st century consumer, which I'm really looking forward to. And then we have Dr. Rex B. Demophilis. He is full professor and chairman of Interdisciplinary Biofuels Research Study Center at the University of Philippines, Los Banos, Philippines. And he will be presenting on ethanol production and use in the Philippines, synergy from local capacity and imports to achieve higher blends. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for this webinar. We're delighted to have you here. And for those that are watching this as a recording after the event, we hope you enjoy it just as much. And I will hand over to Keith to kick us off.
Hello, and thank you, Shahana, for the introduction. I would just like to thank the US Grains Council and Bioenergy Australia for the opportunity to talk to you today about our new report, Ethanol, Australia's Octane Enhancer, the implementation of the aromatics pill reduction in Australia's fuel standards. So TFA Project Group are a consulting engineering firm who have been in the Australian market for over 25 years. We have extensive experience in the conventional fuels market, designing fuel facilities for all applications throughout Australia. But we've also been involved in the biofuels arena for the last 20 years, extensively involved in the sorghum to ethanol biorefinery that was built west of Brisbane some years ago, and also very active in biorefinery feasibility studies, due diligence for government, biogas, hydrogen, dangerous goods, a number of associated industries. TFA's capabilities cover the full project lifecycle, from town planning and master planning through to feasibility studies, front-end engineering, through to detailed design and construction management. So setting the scene, what is octane and why is it important? Octane itself is a chemical which is a member of the hydrocarbon family. It's an 8-carbon octane, 8-carbon hydrocarbon. But its importance is mostly that it's used as a benchmark reference fuel to establish the performance of gasoline or petrol blends. Now, there's a variety of test methods used around the world. The most popular is the research octane number, otherwise known as the RON. And you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there, a typical Australian dispenser, which displays the RON. So 91, 95, 98 octane are our standard regular unleaded premium, 95 octane, and then 98. However, that's not the only system used worldwide. We also have the motor octane number, which is tested in an engine at slightly different conditions. And then an additional term, the anti-knock index, which is the average of the RON and the MON. So you can see an American dispenser there on the left-hand side with the anti-knock index on it, with 87, 89, 93, which is a very similar fuel specification, just a different display of the indexes. Now, each country has specifications for the minimum RON and MON standards. And for instance, I've shown the Australian specifications there. For instance, regular unleaded is a 91 RON with a MON of 81 and slightly higher for the different premium fuels. So whilst we use octane as a reference, it's actually not the main constituent of petrol. In fact, there's no such thing as pure petrol. The composition of petrol is very subject to the crude oil that you use to produce it, and that varies geographically throughout the world. So a typical blend of petrol or gasoline may have over 100 chemicals in it. And basically, these are chemicals with similar boiling points, and when blended will give you the properties that meet the fuel specification. So typically speaking, only 4 to 8% of petrol is alkanes, which includes octane. Then there's a variety of different hydrocarbons there, but notably one of the largest constituents are aromatics, which represent anywhere from 20 to 50%. Now, aromatics as a group of compounds are quite often referred to as BTECs, benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylenes. But the impacts and health impacts, particularly impacts on human health, have been quite well documented for quite a lot of years, with different aromatics having various effects, but benzene in particular is carcinogenic and really has no safe exposure limit. And products such as xylenes are readily absorbed when inhaled. And it's been identified for quite some time that the most common source of human exposure to BTECs is actually in areas of heavy motor vehicle traffic and petrol service stations. So with that knowledge, there's been a global trend around the world to lower the allowable levels of aromatics in petrol. So when you have a look at various countries, South Korea is already down to 24%. The USA is down to 25%. The European Union lowered their limit to 35% in 2005, 16 years ago, and India followed suit in 2010. So in that context, Australia has been lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of our aromatic standards. And our current standard is 42% pill average over 6 months with a cap of 45%. However, that is changing, and the Australian government has now released the fuel quality standard determination, where they will be reducing the pool average of aromatic content petrol from 42 to 35%, effective January the 1st, 2022. So what's the impact of reducing aromatics? The reason aromatics are there is they're relatively common in crude oils and they have very high octane numbers. And these are the individual research and motor octane numbers for a number of the aromatic compounds. And you can see they're all above the normal octane rating of blended gasolines. So if you reduce your aromatic content, then you are reducing your octane rating of your fuel. And as an example, if you decrease the aromatics by 7%, perhaps from 42 to 35%, you can typically expect the octane rating to also decrease by 3 points. So if you do that, you need to maintain your octane level and you need to find an alternative to improve your octane back to the compliance standard. So looking at ethanol as an octane enhancer, for starters, Renewable Fuels Association has done some very good documented testing, comparing ethanol to the aromatic compounds. And the good news is ethanol is actually a superior octane enhancer to the BTEX group of compounds. Now, how much do we need to put into ethanol as an aromatic replacement is a key question. So over the last 10 years, there's been quite a number of publications released that establish a linear correlation between individual component octane rating, their molar concentration, and blend octane. So in this context, ethanol has an advantage because it's much lower molecular weight than the aromatic compounds. So to get the same molar concentration, you actually have to add less mass of ethanol than you would have to all the aromatics. Another feature of ethanol is its blending octane number actually increases with lower octane blend stocks. So you get a higher effect when you're adding it to lower octane blend stocks. So what we did for starters is we decided to theoretically calculate how much ethanol you would need to add. And as a basis for this, we got some data on 3 published Asian gasoline blends with a specific composition of those blends. And we went through the calculations to work out how much ethanol we would need to add to maintain the octane number if we were reducing the aromatics. And the calculations came out around about 60 to 70% of the volume of the aromatics being reduced need to be added as ethanol to maintain the same octane rating. So in the context of these, it's not surprising that ethanol is currently recognized as the world's most popular octane enhancer. So that theory was great for 3 snapshots, but as I said before, the composition of petrol and gasoline varies around the world. So we wanted to put that theory in the context of world experience. And the good thing with ethanol is there is a lot of world experience to look at. There is over 100 billion litres per annum of ethanol used around the world. And that is in a wide variety of countries. So on the graph on the left there, you can see quite a variety of countries with extensive use of ethanol at up to 10% blend, with Brazil as the standout exception, where they operate at up to 47% on average right now. Notably, the USA is the leader in the ethanol utilization. And you can see since 2007, the usage of ethanol has grown substantially across the USA. And right now, we're up to 60 billion litres a year of ethanol consumption in the USA alone, which is the equivalent of virtually every litre of gasoline in the USA having 10% ethanol in it. So this gives us some real world data to look at. I've put up a couple of snapshots here of summaries of where the trends have been over the last 20 years in the USA. And as you can see on the left-hand chart, as the growth of ethanol has increased, the level of aromatics added to US gasoline has decreased substantially, and the olefins have gone down as well. There are limits on olefins that you can add, but olefins are a very high octane ingredient as well, with an octane rating in the order of 150. So the decrease in olefins and the decrease in aromatics has been offset by the octane boosting capabilities of ethanol. So looking at the chart on the right, this has been summarized by the Automobile Association EPA quality trends. And you can see it compares E0 blends and E10 blends. The aromatic content has gone from 32% to just under 22. The olefins have dropped from 9 to 8. but the octane index across the board has remained constant. So in the real world data, we are seeing at least an equivalent increase in ethanol to the decrease in aromatics, at least on a one-to-one basis. It keeps the octane rating the same. So also this data actually supports even less ethanol. What we've taken as a perspective for this report to be conservative as to just how much ethanol might be required to maintain the octane rating, we've worked on a one-to-one volumetric replacement as a conservative position, whilst the theory indicates it's probably a little bit less. So we now know that we're going to work on roughly 1 litre of ethanol to replace 1 litre of aromatics is fairly certain to keep the octane rating the same. The question is how much octane would be required to meet the requirements of the Australian market, where we are looking at aromatic reductions. So the reality is aromatic content is not readily published. We did find some information which is about 6 years out of date for Australian refineries. That indicated for the specific Australian refineries that, not surprisingly, the lowest aromatics were in regular unleaded petrol, with the highest in 98 premium. But that data excluded independents, who represent about a quarter of the Australian market. And at the time, there was at least a third of Australia petrol was imported. So local production wasn't the entire picture. Moving forward to 2021, we've had 2 announcements of closing refineries at the start of this year. So by the end of 2021, Australia will be down to 2 refineries from the original 8. We import roughly about 70% of our crude oil and 40% of our finished petrol. So the reality is we're moving more and more towards an international market and the import of fuel and crude oil into Australia. So in terms of what scenarios we'd model, we decided to exclude unleaded petrol because that is the lowest octane index and generally requires the least octane boosting. But what we did focus on is what is compliant, what is legal fuel to sell in Australia today. So right now, it is legal to sell 42% aromatics, and the legislation is going to reduce it to 35%. So our first scenario was, what is the maximum that might be required based on what people are selling today? And we focused on premium 95 and 98 fuels, which are the highest octane fuels. We then looked at a couple of scenarios for sensitivity. A base scenario with a 2% reduction in aromatics for premium 98 only, which reflected what Australian refineries could do 6 years ago. And then we took a middle ground scenario with a 4% reduction in aromatics for premium 95 and 98 as well. So then we predicted ethanol demand. We did have to look at the Australian fuel sales data, and we made a few allowances for current trends in the market. Regular unleaded volumes are decreasing in the Australian market as 98 premium is increasing. We also made some allowances for the growth of battery electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles potentially, as predicted by the Australian regulators. And this is where we came up with. Essentially, the 7% scenario predicted out to 2030 indicates that we might need as much as 550 million litres per annum of ethanol to meet the required reduction of aromatics, with the 2 other sensitivity scenarios varying from 113 to 314, subject to the quality of the fuel imported into Australia and what the 2 remaining refineries are capable of producing. So on that note, I will pass over to Bavisha Kalichan, my co-author, and she will run you through the practicalities of producing that amount of ethanol and its impacts and benefits.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'm Bavisha Kalichan, the co-author of the report that was published, and I'd like to take you through and take this presentation forward discussing the existing ethanol production capacities and the requirements that we've defined in our report. Looking through the existing ethanol production capacities within the Australian context, we understand that the Queensland ethanol mandate states that the bio-based petrol mandate requires a 4% of the total volume of regular unleaded petrol sales, and ethanol blended fuel sales by liable fuel retailers must be bio-based ethanol. Further, the New South Wales government has a similar stance with a 6% of total petrol sales to be bio-based petrol. But importantly, New South Wales has recently recommitted to achieving this target, starting with increased education on vehicle compatibility. Most Australian vehicles manufactured after 1986 are typically considered to be able to utilize ethanol blends. But when we look at market compatibility, it's important to understand that with the New South Wales recently recommitting to achieving this target, the education factor for this is key. So just how much ethanol do we need? If we were to look at the existing production and how much do we really need? So meeting the mandates will require use of all of Australians' production and an additional 170 million litres. So we understand that the existing Australian capacity is made up of the 436 million litres, and that's made up of 3 existing sites. The Nara site in New South Wales with a capacity of 300 million litres per annum, and that is a starch-based plant. The Dalby biorefinery out in Queensland, a 76 million litre per annum sorghum-based plant. And in addition to that would be the Serena bioethanol facility, approximately 60 million litres per annum, and that being a molasses site. The mandates, even if the mandates are met, this is not enough fuel. And so the government, even though has just renewed this commitment to achieving these mandates, interestingly, to achieve the aromatics reduction, a further 423 million litres would be required by as early as 2022. And as Keith alluded, an additional 550 million litres by 2030 to be able to meet the Australian aromatics legislation to replace the 7% of premium unleaded and 95 and 98. Let's talk through production, existing and proposed. So the table that we've prepared out that you see on the screen, the top 3 sites, as we've described, would be the existing sites. The other sites that you see down below is where we have listed them as proposed. And it's important to understand that based on existing and proposed can be translated to opportunity. And so with the opportunity, the expected capacity, so the sum of the existing, the sum of the proposed sites will equate to an additional 710 million litres of production. So although the Australian ethanol production capacity amounts to this 436, 72% of domestic production required to meet the existing mandates, only about 250 million litres per year is produced. And this is what is crippling the industry. Strong government intervention is needed in order for us to drive the mandates. This could be meted by a demand and contribute to export markets for Australia, both for fuel ethanol and other high demand products. So in the times of the COVID pandemic, we understand the need for ethanol-based products such as hand sanitizers and other, and this would just further enhance the requirement. Importantly, talking through the entrance into the market. So what exactly are the conditions for new market entrance and how much of ethanol could we make? 86% of our sugar is exported in a time where the sugar industry is struggling for economic viability. Approximately 1.9 gigalitres of ethanol could be produced without any change in land use. Additionally, bagasse as a source for additional 2G lignocellulosic technology could be improved. In fact, Australian producers have been struggling to compete, and this would be a perfect opportunity for implementation. So what do we know about feedstocks? Australia's 3 existing ethanol plants have minimal impact on food supply. And the reason for that is because of the low value agricultural co-products as feedstocks. In summary, Australia does not have a food security problem. If you were to look at the Dalby biorefinery that currently uses sorghum as a feedstock, the protein and fiber is still used for food and feed for livestock. Only the starch component is what's used for the ethanol production. So at a time where this industry is struggling economically, Australian producers are struggling to compete with larger markets. Such biomass feedstocks and the introduction of such is estimated at 100 million tons per annum for the 2G ethanol, and this would likely be sufficient to replace all petrol in Australia. Very importantly, the implementation of new technology, understanding what exists and how do we implement the best international practices that we have looked at in preparation of our report. Major role players such as Champoli, Microbiogen, Clariant, Sunliquid, and Praj are all at the forefront of such technology. There are several plants under construction to date. If we were to look at the Clariant Sunliquid site, there's 5 license agreements currently with role players in Slovakia and Poland and other such industry leaders. So whilst we know there are several plants under construction, what are some of the benefits that we're looking at? Well, if we were to look at the Microbiogen plant, they have an improved yeast. They've improved their yeast developments and such that we now see improved sustainability, yield, and reduced land use. It's always important for us for retrofitting of existing sites from standard conventional grain ethanol to a 2G site to understand what the key benefits would be. So as an example, for every acre of sugarcane used to make 2G biofuel, 2.4 acres less farmland will be needed to grow food for human consumption. And we must understand too that with such technologies, international learnings and understanding that these technologies are at the forefront, first generation plants do offer a way forward to introduce such technology. And from a cost perspective, which is extremely important, we understand that the capital cost of cellulosic technology is currently in the order of about $45 per litre of production versus 0.5 to 0.6 US dollars per litre for conventional ethanol. From an investment perspective and understanding what's needed to invest to be able to develop such sites, as compared to approximately 230 million Australian dollars for a 63 million litre cellulosic plant, we're looking at that as a comparison to approximately 150 million Australian dollars for 100 million litre first-gen grain ethanol plant. So we do see huge benefits for trying to implement new technologies, increased innovation so that we can drive the industry forward. So where exactly does opportunities lie? And often we see opportunities where there's adversity. And in the last 12 years, Australia has seen 6 oil refineries close, and that is 75% of production. And coming with the fuel security impact, more importantly comes the job impact and the economic ripple effect of that. So whilst Australia has enjoyed 40 years without a major disruption, we need to be prepared for an unforeseen event. And so with the closure of such mills, we would understand that these brings opportunity for ethanol production. And currently under our obligation as IEA members, we need 90 days of fuel stock. And currently we have 80 days on if the fuel that's on the way to Australia and owned by Australian companies is counted. In many ways, it's important to have a storage of crude oil reserve as it ensures continuity of supply. So what exactly does ethanol bring in terms of job benefits? So there are huge employment opportunities, which was part of the assessment of our report. And based on the experience of the Wilmar site, approximately 160 direct jobs is expected for a typical 100 million litre refinery or site. And this is made up of 80 personnel in production generally and an additional 80 in the distribution sector. And that is extended to biofuels and the rest. 505 indirect jobs in the broader economy through the flow-on effects and interrelated industries are in fact expected. So whilst we understand that most jobs would be in the regional locations, and the reason for that is because generally such plants are constructed in the regional areas closer to feedstocks in order for us to reduce transportation costs. These direct jobs are quite significant. So for the maximum of 600 million litre plants required for the 550 million litre expected ethanol demand, it is envisaged that 960 direct jobs will be created, in the order of 3,000 indirect jobs, and a total of approximately 4,000 total jobs. But what do we know about the international trend? Understanding how significant is that, and what have other countries such as Brazil and the USA have found in regards to jobs. So biofuel supports approximately 832,000 jobs in Brazil alone. And in 2019, there was approximately 68,000 direct jobs in the USA and 280,000 jobs created in the USA just by means of additional employment opportunities created because of the industry. Global employment data, and this is really important in the Australian context, global employment data suggests that the Australian biofuel production target of 20 gigalitres could provide an ongoing employment opportunity in the country of approximately 250,000 jobs. And that is key. That is key for understanding job security and economic security. So, alluding to the benefits of ethanol, Keith has touched on it, and I'd like to just close out the presentation looking through benefits. So we understand ethanol is non-toxic, it's not carcinogenic, it's a clean alternative for octane boosting. And so in Australia, ethanol at 10%, our calculations show that we can reduce emissions by approximately 2.6 million tons of CO2 per year. And so with the scenarios that Keith has described, it is envisaged that 0.8 million tons of CO2 is expected to be reduced in scenario 1, 0.2 million tons in scenario 2, and 0.5 million scenario in scenario 3, respectively. So with ethanol, as it reduces particulate matter, which is uncombustible harmful particles, we understand that this is a clean solution that is easy enough to implement. I'd like to close this presentation just taking you through the summary of our report and the major findings. So what are the benefits of expanded ethanol production, and where does investment lie? So renewed commitment to mandates in Queensland and New South Wales is key. We need to understand that current production is not able to be met, the demand is not able to be met by current production. We understand further that the replacement of aromatics with ethanol will require a total of approximately 550 million litres in the end state, which will be required by the year 2030. We need ethanol in order to create a domestic industry that is robust. This will pave the way forward and not only provide economic security, fuel security, but in addition, create livelihoods for job security and a future for the agricultural sector. So a 100 million litre plant is expected to require approximately 120 million investment to create. But importantly, $85 million in revenue per year is expected, 160 direct jobs, and further to that, 505 indirect jobs. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to co-author this report with TFA's engineering manager, Keith Sharp. On behalf of Keith Sharp and myself, Bavisha, we would like to thank Bioenergy Australia, the US Grain Councils, and all the associations and members associated for the opportunity to present today and prepare the report. Thank you.
Good morning and good evening from here in the United States. I'm Chris Blally with Growth Energy. Pleasure to be with you all, and certainly a pleasure to follow Keith and Bavisha. I thought that was a fantastic report and covered a lot of the issues that we deal with ethanol here in the United States. So I want to touch on ethanol as the 21st century fuel for the 21st century consumer and talk about the experience that we've had here in the United States. So Growth Energy, just so everyone knows, we are the world's largest renewable fuel organization. We represent 91 ethanol production plants here in the United States, 91 associated businesses in the ethanol supply chain, ag businesses and such, as well as tens of thousands of biofuel supporters across the United States. You can see our websites on the left, growthenergy.org. Getbiofuel.com is a consumer-oriented website. And for those who follow racing, American Ethanol Racing, where we use higher ethanol blends here in our racing series in the United States. So Keith and Bhavisha touched on this a little bit, but just so everyone understands the US market of what we produce and what we blend as far as ethanol, we produce right around 16 billion gallons or 60 billion liters of ethanol. And we use about 14.5 billion gallons annually, or about 55 billion liters here in the US. The rest is exported around the world. And we use it in a variety of blends, mostly as E10, 10% ethanol blended. We also have E15, which is now approved for all 2001 and newer vehicles. We have E85 or flex fuel that's available in roughly 20 million flex fuel vehicles here in the US. And we also are starting to see the emergence of mid-level blends, E25, E30. So today, and Keith mentioned this, 98%, virtually every gallon of gasoline or every liter of gasoline here in the US is blended with 10% ethanol. Our refiners have optimized around producing a finished fuel with ethanol as the octane component, just as was just talked about. It's approved for use in all engines, including light duty vehicles, cars, trucks, motorcycles, boats, as well as off-road engines. So lawn equipment, small engines, any number of things here in the US are approved for use with ethanol blended fuels. E10 is our fuel across the country. It's also for use in all regions of the country. We've heard this criticism at times that you can't use ethanol blended fuels in high altitude regions or sometimes in low altitude regions, but we use it nationwide here in the US in all varying regions and climates. And what has it really done for our rural economy? We have 200 biorefineries here in the US. 350,000 jobs, that's direct and indirect, generated $35 billion in our gross domestic product. We've increased our energy security. We were at one time importing 60% of our oil from overseas. We're now down to 25%. Now, certainly that is not all due to ethanol. A lot has to do with domestic oil production as well. But we are now 10% of the fuel supply here in the US and have contributed into the reduction in imported oil. And we're also cleaning our air. Today's ethanol, on average, reduces greenhouse gas emissions 46% compared to gasoline. It also reduces harmful toxic additives that we've just talked about, benzene, toluene, xylene. These are additives that are linked to smog and groundwater contamination as well. And we're saving consumers money. Some studies show that with the octane benefits and other benefits, we're saving as much as $1.50 a gallon with the addition of ethanol to our fuel. So let's take a little bit of look at the history or the drivers of growth here in the US. And then we'll look at the drivers of growth for the future and talk about decarbonization as well. So in 1990, with our Clean Air Act amendments, you really had the first effort to introduce ethanol and oxygenated fuels. There was an effort to add oxygenation to our fuel so that fuels burn more completely. And you saw the emergence of ethanol in some places. Denver was one of the first markets here in the Western United States. One of the other oxygenates that emerged at the time was also MTBE. And unfortunately, MTBE became contaminated a number of municipal water supplies. So you saw in the early 2000s that instead of MTBE being used as an oxygenate, people were very concerned about this impact on water quality and the environment. And so MTBE was phased out. And ethanol became much more available and a competitive as an alternative for a number of the things that Keith and Bhavisha talked about. And then in 2005 and 2007, we saw two major laws here in the US on energy independence and security, and they established our renewable fuel standard. The renewable fuel standard has really helped drive and reinforce the move towards biofuel blends and towards decarbonization here in the United States. Established enforceable renewable blending targets through 2022 and actually beyond. Beyond 2022 is a little bit different system of how they're set up, but established essentially targets for conventional biofuels, which is largely starch-based ethanol from corn, cellulosic ethanol, bio-based diesel, as well as other advanced biofuels. These are volumetric obligations. So just for example, for the last volume that was set was 20.09 billion gallons, 15 billion gallons of which is assumed to be conventional biofuels or largely starch ethanol. It's not a specific blend rate, so we don't require that 10% ethanol be sold or 11% ethanol be sold. It's that those specific volume obligations have to be met by our oil refiners and fuel manufacturers and importers. And so this is done through our Environmental Protection Agency. There are fines, but there's also flexibility in the requirements given to refiners to physical blending. But the important thing is that the biofuels have to be demonstrated to be blended somewhere into the system. It also generated investment in feedstock and production, including next generation. We have a number of facilities looking at cellulosic production, including cellulosic production from kernel fiber from corn. So what's going to happen towards the future? Today, as I said, our de facto fuel is E10, a 10% ethanol blend. We now have approval of E15 for all 2001 and newer vehicles, which is 95% of our vehicle fleet today. And E15 is available at roughly 2,500 locations here in the US. I'll show a map shortly. And with E15, we see that as an intermediate step towards mid-level blends, E25 and E30. But just with E15, we're just getting off the ground with E15. If we nationally, if we move to E15, we would decrease greenhouse gas emissions by an additional 17 million tons, or the equivalent of taking roughly 4 million cars off the road each year. As we look further towards mid-level blends, really capturing the benefits of higher octane fuels and really capturing some of the benefits of ethanol's octane properties. Future engines are going to need higher octane fuels because they're going to be smaller and lighter engines, increased horsepower, higher compression, and so are really going to demand higher octane fuels. And that's where a mid-level blend, a 25 to 30% ethanol, can be a much higher octane number, sort of a 98 RON, a premium fuel, or a 91, 92 here in the United States. And then climate. This is certainly top and foremost on everybody's mind, not only here in the United States, but around the world. Ethanol helps countries address their national climate and GHG goals, as well as toxic emissions. It helps diversify and stabilize our fuel supply, moving us away from fossil fuel. It encourages rural development and certainly consumer economic benefits as well. I touched on E15. We have roughly 150,000 fueling locations here in the US. Today, we're approaching 2,500 E15 locations, and we have more than 5,000 sites selling higher blends, flex fuels for flex fuel vehicles. So lots of room to grow for E15. We also have, with those 5,000 sites, we have a great deal of infrastructure to get higher blends out there well into the future as well. So let's talk a little bit about decarbonization. Ethanol has a very important role to play. There's been a great deal of emphasis on zero emission vehicles, on electric vehicles and fuel cells, and they will play an important role in decarbonization as well. But here you can see a snapshot of the US fleet. You know, again, this is 2018, but the trend has roughly has continued. Nearly all of the sales have been internal combustion engines and continue to rely on liquid fuels, where a small portion of sales have been zero emission vehicles. And so how do you decarbonize that broader red ring at the same time as some of these alternative technologies flourish? This is really this is our Department of Energy's outlook on vehicle sales type going out to 2050. And you can see that gasoline and flex fuel vehicles, the large blue bars here, continue to be the dominant choice well for decades to come. So you have to address, if you're going to be serious about decarbonization and you want to get to goals such as net zero by 2050 or whatever the climate goals may be, you have to do something to decarbonize the fuels used in those vehicles. And that's where ethanol and biofuels play a dominant role. Not only today, we can capture those benefits by moving to higher blends such as E15, but with mid-level blends and continuing encouraging policies, we can drive even further and get those greenhouse gas reductions even lower. You know, bioethanol's greenhouse gas emission profile, I touched on it earlier, but you know, a snapshot of the US industry shows that we're 46% lower than gasoline. And that's just a snapshot. With readily available technologies, we can get lower and lower. And we have some plants that think they can actually get to zero net emissions compared to gasoline. You know, looking at carbon sequestration, things on the energy side, use of waste heat, as well as significant improvements on the agriculture side as well. So the trend in the industry is to get better yields, as well as to continue to innovate and get that carbon score even lower and lower. So this is just a snapshot of, you know, some of our state policies that are moving beyond even the federal government, looking at low carbon fuels. And so today on our West Coast, California, Oregon, and now Washington all have low carbon or clean fuel standards. California is roughly 10%, or it is 10% of our fuel consumption here in the US, and they've been a real driver of environmental policy, and they continue to lead on the low carbon fuel standard. And I'll show these in a bit, but one of the things that has really driven their low carbon fuel system in California has been the use of biofuels. It has been the main driver of credits and compliance under their system. So this is California's program. They essentially continue to ratchet down the carbon intensity of their transportation fuel. And so a fuel that is, you know, lower in carbon intensity than this line generates credits. One that's higher generates deficits. And so you can see the trend since California implemented their low carbon fuel standard, the trend in gasoline and the trend in ethanol and its carbon intensity. Gasoline has gotten a little bit higher, while ethanol has dropped dramatically as our plants and agriculture continue to innovate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a snapshot of the credits generated in California's low carbon fuel system. It's a little bit difficult to read in the volumes, but the big blue bar at the bottom is ethanol. Ethanol has really driven the most credits under California's low carbon fuel program. And really, if you take ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel, all biofuels have generated, you know, nearly all of the credits in the decade of the roughly decade of the program. This, again, capturing some of the same sentiment. The orange represents the ethanol credit percentages The orange represents the ethanol credit percentage over the last decade under California's program. And so while we aren't generating quite the percentage that we did a decade ago, we are still the majority portion under the program and generating quite a bit of carbon reduction for the state of California. And many other states are looking at this program or a similar program. And it's important that anybody who's really looking at some sort of decarbonization program has to look at a way, as I talked about, has to look at a way to use today's fuel to generate greenhouse gas reductions. And that's where ethanol plays an important role. Not only the octane benefits that Keith and Bhavisha talked about and the consumer benefits and the jobs, but you're driving those greenhouse gas reductions as well. And, just a couple things here to end on, just to put things in context. I think people also get concerned about, we've sort of maximized our industry. We don't have the ability to supply anymore. You can really see over the last 14 years what we've done as an industry. We went from 6 billion gallons of production to roughly 16 billion gallons of production. So 22 billion liters to that. Now we have the capacity to produce about 64 billion liters if all capacity were online at the same time. I think it's also important to recognize that during that time, we did not see significant land use change. What has happened in the United States is that the yields of our acres have improved, almost exponentially over the last century, rather than you see additional acres. Just as an example, in 2019, we planted the exact same amount of acres as we did in 1940. But you can see the yield is dramatically different. In 1940, you were getting 29 bushels per acre. In 2019, you get 172 bushels per acre. And you can see that trend line, the green, the yield continuing to increase while the acres essentially stay flat. So even holding corn acres planted at 2007, we could increase production by another 1.5 billion gallons over the next 5 years. And this, the growth really reflects longstanding trends. Our farmers continue to do better and better. Our plants continue to do better and better on yield. And so there's a lot of efficiency gains, both on the ag and on the biorefinery side. And with that, that's it. That ends my presentation. Glad to be with you all. Certainly appreciate the U.S. Grains Council and everyone having me, and look forward to the questions.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much, U.S. Grains and Bioenergy Australia, for having me here. Let me present our researches on the decarbonization in the Philippines. Basically, the title is Ethanol Production and Use in the Philippines, a synergy from local capacity and imports to achieve higher blends. And this one is with industry sensitivity and projection studies. Let me clear first. Sorry. Okay. January 12, 2007 was the date when we have the first biofuels legislation in Southeast Asia. It's through the Republic Act 9367, or we call it Biofuels Law of 2006, that mandates the biofuel blending to all gasoline and diesel fuel sold in the country. Basically, the Biofuels Act of 2006 mandates us and has these specific aims. That is to develop and utilize indigenous, renewable, sustainably sourced, clean energy to reduce our dependence on imported oil, mitigate toxic and greenhouse gas emissions, increase rural employment and income, and ensure the availability of alternative and renewable clean energy without any detrimental to the natural ecosystem, biodiversity, and food reserve of the country. You see, we have two drivers here. It's on the energy efficiency or energy independence and environmental aspect. And even before the issue on food versus fuel, which was the greatest issue in 2007 on biofuels, we have already incorporated in our law the safeguarding of our food reserve as well as our natural ecosystem. There are some incentives under this Philippine biofuels law. One is the specific tax per liter is zero. There is exemption on value-added tax on sales of raw material used in the production of biofuels. High priority from government financial institutions to entities, companies that will be engaged in production, storage, handling, and transport of biofuels and biofuel feedstock, including the blending with petroleum as certified by the Department of Energy. Exempt from wastewater charges. And in 2012, the Department of Energy issued this Department Circular number 2011-02001, mandating the full implementation of 10% ethanol blending to all gasoline sold in the country.
Dr. X, sorry to interrupt you. Do you want to put it in presentation mode right now? There's a little slider at the bottom right corner, and then to the left of it, it's a little icon. Just click on that and it'll go into full screen mode. Bring your cursor down a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying, but I can't.
Your cursor doesn't go down all the way?
Let me see again. Let me see. No.
There's a little slider at the very bottom of the screen.
Yeah. I use this in our
Yeah,
project.
and now go to the left a little bit. Keep going to the left.
Okay. Let's see. Can
Go
you
to the
see it?
left. Next to the slider, you're too far right. There's a little presentation tab.
Actually, I cannot see. There's block. So, I close this. Okay. Was able to get the. Okay, I'm sorry for that. Very sorry. We were practicing.
There you
early.
go.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, where did I stop? Okay. Okay. So the Philippine Biofuels Act of 2006, or Republic Act 9367, established the creation of the National Biofuels Board, basically to manage our biofuels program. And this is composed of several national agencies, headed by the Department of Energy, then the Department of Agriculture, basically ensuring the supply of feedstock, the Department of Science Technology that would lead in the research and development, Department of Labor, the Department of Finance, Department of Trade and Industry, the Philippine Coconut Authority for the biodiesel aspect, and of course, the Sugar Regulatory Administration that would manage the program on bioethanol. Also, there are other stakeholders in the National Biofuels Program composed of other national government agencies, the Department of Agrarian Reform, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Transportation and Communication, the National Commission of Indigenous People, and the local government units. And of course, the industry is part of the bigger stakeholder, from the oil company, biofuel producer, the import end user. And on the research side, research institutions and academic institutions are also involved, such as the Philippine Sugar Research and other private companies other universities and other research institutions, helping the development of this emerging industry in the Philippines. So way back in 2013 or 2012, there was already a national biofuels plan created by the National Biofuels Board of the Department of Energy, putting the schedule of the increase in blending. Supposedly in 2011, we have the 10%, but it was quite delayed for a year, such that the Department order of the Department of Energy came up in 2012 and mandating the immediate use of 10%. And currently, supposedly we will have 20% in 2020, but currently we still have 10% ethanol blending to all our gasoline sold in the country. So in 2030, it is planned to have the 20% and the 85% optional ethanol blending to all our gasoline sold in the country. So this is the latest roadmap, biofuels roadmap for the 2018 to 2040. As you can see, for the bioethanol, there is a constant review of the bioethanol mandate. And for a long-term plan for 2023 to 2040, E20 may be implemented if we will be able to address some of our problems or issues on higher blending. So let me present to you the status of the Philippine bioethanol industry. Currently, we have 12 bioethanol distilleries in the country, and we have a total of 318.5 million liters per year. And as you can see here, out of these 380.5 million liters per year for the 12 distilleries, there is still potential of about 113 million liters per year from the ongoing under construction projects. However, in 2017, our production was only about 234.65. The sale is almost the same. And in 2018, the total production is 295 and the sales was 303. So you will see later the relationship between our local production and the mandated needed volume for our 10% ethanol blending. So these are some of the pictures of two companies having undergoing construction for their bioethanol distilleries, with Cavite Biofuels Producers Incorporated for 38 million liters per year capacity, and the Asian Alcohol with 30 million liters per year in Magallanes, Cavite, and in Negros Occidental, respectively. So in one of our studies, way back in 2018, it was launched in 2018, we were able to account for the positive impacts of the bioethanol or blending of bioethanol in the country starting from 2009 and up to 2016, where we were able to estimate the greenhouse gas avoidance of about 10 million metric tons, a rural employment of 1.2 million, the foreign exchange savings of about 48 billion. And we stopped, just like the US, we stopped the use of MTBE. Now, let me discuss to you the another study we just completed, the socioeconomic and environmental impact of ethanol production in the Philippines, covering 11 distilleries out of the total 12 distilleries in the country. So this is the summary table, and this constitute two phases. The phase one was conducted in 2017-2018 with 4 ethanol distilleries participating, and phase two conducted in 2019 to 2020 data and was submitted only this year, covering the 7 distilleries. So we came up with the carbon footprint or global warming potential in terms of grams CO2 equivalent per liter, and we estimated the greenhouse gas reduction potential. By the way, in this research, we use an Excel base, the material and energy balances, and as well as SEMA Pro software for the life cycle assessment of the 11 ethanol distilleries in the country. So based on the original phase one result, using this 2017-2018 data, and for the phase 1, and using 2019 to 2020 data for the phase 2, we were able to estimate the carbon footprint of our ethanol production in the Philippines having 1,090.55 grams CO2 equivalent per liter, or an equivalent of greenhouse gas reduction of 59.58%. But when we tried to adjust the phase 1, we adjust the costing of molasses, the yield of molasses, because there was changes in our sugar industry, molasses recovery, as well as when we use CIMA-PRO and we try to account the coal extraction used by some of our distilleries, we make just some adjustments and try to compute the same. The carbon footprint at the 1,199.61 grams CO2 equivalent per liter, and a greenhouse gas reduction potential of about 55.54. So we tried to look at the references in the literature, and from Mekonnen publication in 2018, we have Brazil having a greenhouse gas reduction of about 69, and US having a 64.72% greenhouse gas reduction. I think Grace mentioned about 46% greenhouse gas reduction of the current ethanol production using corn in the US. When we tried to compare with the EcoInvent database of CIMA-PRO, because we also use CIMA-PRO, the registered reduction of greenhouse gas using sugarcane in Brazil was 31.58, and the US for corn is 27.19. So for the carbon footprint of ethanol production in the country, we could say that out of 11 ethanol distilleries, or out of 12, the ethanol distilleries, 11 of which registered a 1.2 kilograms, or that is almost 1,200 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per liter, and a greenhouse gas reduction of 55.45% for the Philippines 11 ethanol distillery. Again, this is covered under the 2 projects, phase 1 and phase 2, for the socio-economic and environmental impacts of bioethanol production in the Philippines. So we tried also to do sensitivity and projection as part of the project. And as you can see here, in 2025, we tried to have 2 scenarios, having a 10% and hopefully there will be 20%. And for 2030, again, the same scenario of 10% and 20%, and the optional 85% if implemented. And we tried to compute for the greenhouse gas reduction using these percentages based on the projected gasoline demand. And we also tried to compute for the greenhouse gas emission avoidance on every year for every blending scenario. And you can see here that decarbonization, a contribution of ethanol for our fuel or transport sector would really help the country in reducing and attaining its commitment for the reduction of our carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emissions. So the synergy of local and imported, this is the data coming from the Department of Agriculture, and this is the local feedstock utilized in 2020. By the way, we have the joint administrative order to 2008, that's 1, which is the feedstock for bioethanol production must be sourced locally to boost the country's rural economy. And the same job provides us safety nets for our land to be used for biofuels production, and also the securing our food production especially in our irrigated lands. So in this local feedstock scenario for 2020, we have basically 2 sources of our ethanol: the sugar cane and the sugarcane molasses, the byproduct. Before, it used to be about 3% of the sugar cane in terms of tonnage is the equivalent of molasses. Now it's more than 4% in terms of tonnage. And in terms of the 12 ethanol distilleries, 3 could utilize sugar cane. The rest uses molasses. But of course, these 3 ethanol distilleries that are using sugar cane could also use molasses, in short, in combination. So based on our local production, we have about 1.134 million metric tons of molasses produced. And in our standard calculation, we use a yield conversion or ethanol conversion for molasses at 245 liters per metric ton. That would give us about 278 million liters for a 1.134 million metric ton of molasses. But what was utilized only for our bioethanol was 1.076 million metric ton. On the sugar cane, we have the based on the available dedicated area, because we have we have more than 400,000 hectares of sugar cane plantation in the country. But based on the dedicated area for bioethanol, the maximum tonnage is about 975,000. And in our computation, we use the 70 liters as our ethanol yield for every metric ton of sugarcane, giving us about 68 million liters. However, what was utilized was only about 583 metric tons. So on the last column, you can see that in the projected mandated demand or volume of bioethanol, we need about 756.96 million liters for 2020. And as you can see, our current capacity is 380.5 million liters. And if we try to add the maximum ethanol that could be produced from both molasses and sugarcane, we have a maximum of 446 million liters, or equivalent to about 46% of the feedstock requirement. And if we use the feedstock use, we will be having only about 279.6 million liters per year. So you can see in this figure that with a 10% ethanol blending as mandated by law through our National Biofuels Board, we need about 756 million liters per year, yet our capacity for our ethanol, combined capacity of our ethanol distillery is only about 380 million liters per year. And the maximum ethanol that could be produced based on our feedstock, both for molasses and sugarcane from the dedicated area, is only about 348. And this is one of the issues that we have here in the country, the lack of feedstock basically, and the lack also of capacity. The country has also what we call the bioethanol reference price. So we have this reference price equation on how to compute for the reference price of ethanol in terms of peso per liter. So basically, it's the average composite price of the sugar crystal times this is 1.88 bags per ton. This is our yield, crystal yield, and 70% goes to this is the sharing. There's a sharing between planters and sugar mills. And of course, this is the constant that we use for our conversion yield of 70 liters per ton cane. And the molasses price plus 450 per metric ton for our transportation costs included, and the yield constant for molasses at 245. So this is a 50-50, and there is an added conversion cost per liter of 22.29 pesos that would represent the manufacturing cost, finance cost, and profit. So if you can see here for the month of September 2020 or January 2021, with the molasses price and the sugar crystal price, the price index in the Philippines as a guide ranges from 58.57 pesos per liter to 56.68 pesos per liter. So about higher blends and UP support, my university, University of the Philippines. I came from University of the Philippines in Los Baños campus, but we have also joint project and support from other campuses like University of the Philippines and Diliman. So let me present to you this paper which I presented, the entitled Ethanol in the Philippines, Injecting Octane into the Bioeconomy. This was presented, I think, 2 years ago. And this is the result of a successful launching of our policy book held in January 31, 2018. I have here with me some of the authors, including the Chancellor of the university. And this policy paper looks at the if the Philippines would increase its blending from E10 to E20, what would be our options? And we try to focus in three policy options. The first policy option is E20M. This stands for molasses. In short, if we have the first option in using all imported molasses, we import molasses, convert it to ethanol in the country at a certain tonnage to meet the difference between local production and the projected volume demand based on E20. What would be the scenario? And this is compared to, of course, to the current E10 business as usual scenario. The second policy option is we go into E20, 20% ethanol, by importing totally ethanol from other countries to match with our local ethanol volume and the mandated volume at 20%. And the third option, the last option, is going into E20, but the combination of 50% imported ethanol and 50% imported ethanol and 50% imported molasses that would complement our local production to meet the projected demand at E20. So the study was originally for year 2020 when we tried to have a program of increasing our blending to 20% in 2020. So we tried to consider the following criteria for the policy analysis. Of course, first is the food security, energy security. Second is food security. We considered the Joint Administrative Order 2008 in mandating in securing our food security production, including the lands, especially irrigated lands, the economic costs, the rural economy, the environmental aspect, the political acceptability, the investment attractiveness, and some technical considerations. Having these 8 major criteria for the policy analysis, we tried also to have, also under sub-criteria, for example, for economic costs, the annual forex, the estimated composite price of ethanol if we will blend. Because currently we have, as you can see, the price of ethanol in the country based on the price index is about 56. And because of lack of volume, we import ethanol at a lower price. So we tried also to estimate the composite price of the ethanol if we increase our blending to E20, and we will be importing a cheaper ethanol from other countries. How about the investment requirement? Of course, when you have molasses to be imported, you need fermentation tanks, distillation, and dehydration. And for example, for E20, if you import the finished product, you may not have additional investment on your processing area or processing plant. The combination of molasses and ethanol would again require some investments, and the pricing would be different, of course. So each of these major and major criteria or factors, we try to rate them. The best option is on green, the second best option on blue, and we tried to calculate for the weighted score of these 3 different options, as well as the business as usual at E10. So based on the total weight scores times 1,000, E10 is having about 159.87. And if we try to look at the weighted score of totally importing molasses, it is higher at 207.30. It's higher than that of the current 10%. When we have totally a scenario of totally importing ethanol, we will have 265, and the combination of molasses and ethanol importation at 234. So the team recommended, if ever we go into E20 or increasing our blending from 10% to 20%, E10 to E20, we recommended that we go into the total importation of ethanol to complement with our local production. But of course, there is a collatilla here. It should not be forever. And we feel that there should be also measures that would be included here so that the importation would not be permanent. And we try to identify some of the issues that should be addressed and what should be the corresponding programs that should be associated if ever there will be increase to 20% on the current feedstock volume scenario and the current ethanol distillery capacity scenario. And when we tried to look at the impact of the implementation of 20% ethanol blending in the country, we were able to estimate the further reduction of greenhouse gas emission and the estimated avoidance of about 28.2 million tons for 2020 to 2030. There will be a forex exchange savings of about 18 billion and an additional of 16,877 rural employment. And more significant contribution to the E20 implementation is on the energy mix. Of course, there will be significant contribution on it. And again, the move to supply the local ethanol volume with imported ethanol would not require additional investment. And there would be improvement on trade balance because there is now you have a foreign exchange savings. So in the last statement of this study, that the team believes that pursuing E20 may signal a guaranteed market for the local Philippine industry, which may increase the attractiveness of bioethanol to both local and foreign investors and from other stakeholders. In this approach, the implementation of E20 could be hastened through development of indigenous bioethanol feedstock. So there is a collatilla that we need to develop. We need to increase our biofeedstock or bioethanol raw material volume, as well as the necessary distillery capacity, currently at 380 million liters only. And ultimately, the increase in ethanol blending from E10 to E20 will position the Philippines as a global leader in terms of renewable energy policy. So this is the plan of the University of the Philippines to support the E20 program if ever it will be implemented or even before the implementation. We have submitted our breeding and increased yield program for sugarcane. From the scenario that I have presented earlier, there is a great gap, a big gap, and our land planted with sugarcane does not increase. And we believe that only breeding vertical increase in yield would be the answer to the need or deficiency, insufficiency of our feedstock. And of course, we have some other programs to increase the yield, including the good agricultural practices and using some of our good varieties. Including here, of course, is for the government and public sector to believe that higher blendings, just like US E15, we propose, and this is under evaluation, the vehicle testing for higher blends for E15 and E20 simultaneously with E10 for our gasoline-fired vehicles. And of course, science-based policy development such as this study and development of standards like sustainability, our carbon footprint and water footprint and energetics for our ethanol production systems. So I think this is all for me, and thank you very much for listening. And again, thank you very much US Grains and Bioenergy Australia and the rest of our collaborative agencies for having me here, and Philippine national agencies for helping me craft this presentation. Thank you. Good morning. Good day to everyone.
Okay. I don't know if everyone can hear me, but thanks very much. They were really interesting talks there from Keith, Wishva, Chris, and Dr. Rex. So my name's Jeff Bell. Shahana introduced me earlier. I'm the CEO of Microbiogen, and I'll be the moderator for the rest of this this discussion. So we've now got opportunities for people to ask questions. For those that haven't used this before, if you'll see your screen, if you move your mouse over it, down the bottom, you'll see a little thing called Q&A. If you click on that and type in a question, I will see that up on one of my other screens, and I will go through those questions, and I will try to put them up on the screen. Otherwise, or to our presenters to answer those questions. So we'll give that a go and start up right now. So I already have a whole bunch of questions here. Some questions I'll just read out myself. Others I will bring up on the screen. So the first question I have, and I don't know if anyone can see that there, but the question is it technically possible to remove all the BTEX from petrol and replace with ethanol? I'm guessing this is a Chris or Bhavisha question, but I'll open it to all the panelists.
Actually, I was going to say, I'll leave it to Keith and Bhavisha. I think they've probably done a little more recent work on this.
Okay, I'll have a shot at that one. Thanks, Jeff. So essentially, from a composition perspective, you could certainly remove all of the aromatics and replace them with ethanol. The only restriction you come across mainly is in terms of the allowable limit within your fuel standard. So in Australia, we are limited to a maximum of 10% ethanol today. Obviously in the US, there's been moves to move towards 15%. And beyond that, you can have much higher percentages if you start to embrace flexible fuel vehicles. Now, flexible fuel vehicles are widely available. There's over 20 million of them operating around the world, and those vehicles can operate up to on 100% ethanol if you want them to. And there's a lot of such vehicles operating in the USA. But from a perspective of implementing it in the near term, Australia's limitation would be to exceed 10% ethanol, and we would need to revise our fuel standards to go above that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Keith. And what we've seen in the US is we have the ability to get there. But certainly in our fuel today, we're starting to see the emergence of E15, and we have a lot of flex fuel out there, but we still have a fair amount of aromatics. We do have some state restrictions on aromatics as well, but again, there's fairly significant amounts of aromatics in our gasoline today.
All righty, very good. Look, moving to the next question. Obviously, there's a lot of room for ethanol to get into the fuel supply. But the question I've got is, how about the ethanol price compared to fossil fuel prices? And I think that's probably different depending which country you're in. So I'll open that floor, I guess, for pretty much all the presenters to answer. Maybe start with Keith.
Yeah, the essential part about pricing for ethanol is the feedstock you use. And the feedstock is quite varied in Australia. There are a lot of options. And some of the easy options, such as the sugar that we export and don't use ourselves, and we export over our 80% of the sugar production from Australia in a very competitive worldwide flooded market. If we were to divert that, we could make ethanol very competitively with our current petrol prices. But if we were to start to take advantage of the biomass that we are accumulating, and a recent CSIRO report suggested we'd have over 100 million tonnes per annum of biomass in terms of wheat straws and sorghum straws, bagasse from a sugarcane and other wastes, then the cost of those is very cheap because you're already growing a crop for a purpose, whether it be for sorghum or wheat or whatever. And whilst you leave some of the residues on the field for fertilizing the existing field, a lot of those are not used for any beneficial purpose. And you're getting very, very cheap feedstocks. And the price of lignocellulosic technology is coming down with time. The other side of the coin is that they're now starting to develop plants to use municipal solid waste. And Australia's got a particular problem, as we used to export a lot of our municipal waste overseas, and now we can't do that any longer. And so it's putting pressure on our landfills. So Fulcrum are a great example of a plant in the USA who are actually developing a plant developed biofuels from municipal solid waste, and that isn't even in the numbers for biomass. That's a future option as well. But using waste biomass and woody residues and all that sort of stuff is very economic because the feedstocks are very cheap.
Very good, thanks, Keith. Dr. Rex, how's the situation in the Philippines? Fossil fuels versus ethanol price.
Yeah, before it used to have a significant gap, but now the price of gasoline and the reference price of ethanol in the country are approaching very near. The only problem here is when you compare the ethanol that you'll be importing, which is at lower price compared to the local ethanol produced in the country.
And Chris, the US perspective.
Sure. I mean, there have been rare instances where ethanol has been more expensive than gasoline, but for the most part, over the last decade, ethanol has been less expensive than gasoline, and that's that's purely comparing gallon to gallon. If you get into some of the octane discussion and some of the replacement of some of the more expensive components of gasoline, we come out even better. But largely, we have been less expensive, and blending ethanol has reduced prices not only for our fuel manufacturers, but reduced prices at the pump for American consumers.
Thanks very much. And Bhavisha, is there anything you'd like to add, or we move to the next question?
Yeah, I represent the Australian market too, so happy to move on to the next question.
Okay, very good. So the next question is quite an interesting one. There's obviously a lot of opportunity to increase ethanol production into the current fuel system, and the real question is what is the financial viability for the next generation of biofuels, which I think you guys explained is a little bit more expensive, if there's going to be a switch to other forms, hydrogen or perhaps electric vehicles, etc., beyond 2030. Sorry, I'll open that to the floor. That question.
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on that regarding the cellulosic aspect and just where the pricing will take us, and perhaps Keith wants to talk further on the electric vehicles and the 2030 prediction. But in terms of existing sites and the grain ethanol sites within the Australian context, it's relatively straightforward for us to retrofit these sites. And in addition to the capacity that we've seen for the existing sites, the table in our presentation talks through where the opportunities exist. So we've got multiple sites at the moment, some even due to close because of lack of production and reduced capacities for various reasons. So in terms of capacity constraints and where the opportunities lie, there is significant opportunity for us to be able to use, number one, varying feedstocks. So woody biomass type feedstocks to create 2G ethanol, and understanding that the increase in production of ethanol with such technology comes without massive increase in land use. And so when we talk through the cost and the capital cost of such technology, that's also an interesting aspect, because most investors are looking at how do we reap benefits with reduced emissions. And so with the 2030 prediction that the cost of cellulosic ethanol technology is meant to drop anyway by probably $0.2 per liter from a capital cost perspective, that introduces opportunity again. So as the technology matures, there's opportunity for us to retrofit existing sites. But on the back of that, there's also tacked on that would be the electric vehicle component, which Keith can allude to. But in essence, there is opportunity in the Australian context because we have existing sites with potential. And when I speak potential, I'm really speaking about infrastructure already exists. If one was to look at a sugar mill as it stands, the logistical structure is already in place. The utility demand will already be in place. And so retrofitting sites generally does not pose too much of a threat from a cost perspective and implementation. And that's coupled with what the EV demand looks like for 2030.
I'll just follow up on that with the growth of battery electric vehicles and hydrogen. They are certainly talked about a lot. And it's interesting that Australia produced an Australian electric vehicle market study in 2018. And that was sponsored by ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And basically the predictions they put forward, we are relatively on track on. And the success of these technologies depends on the average Australian spending the money on a new battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen vehicle. In the current market, a battery electric vehicle as a minimum is around about 3 times the cost of an average vehicle in Australia. And that's a basic vehicle. The hydrogen vehicles are 5 times the cost of the minimum price vehicle on the market right now today. So the reality is that they're not taking off by consumer demand for somebody to pay 3 to 5 times the amount. And the prediction from the Australian market study was by the year 2040, unless there is very substantial government assistance, only 30% of the vehicles in Australia will be battery electric or hydrogen. Maybe 55% if the government starts handing out very significant grants, but that's in 20 years' time. We need a solution today. We need to start addressing our greenhouse gas emissions today. So the growth of these vehicles will come, but the reality is that not going to be readily dominating the market unless the price comes down or they become more competitively priced, because we are talking multitudes higher than the price of a conventional gasoline vehicle. So the other side of battery electric vehicles, for instance, is 80% of our electricity generation in Australia is currently from fossil fuels. So if you were to run a battery electric vehicle today, you're using electricity generated from fossil fuels 80% during the day. And if you were to recharge it during the night, which is what a lot of people do, because the average electric vehicle, if you charge at home, is going to take 8 hours, well, that will almost be exclusively with fossil fuel electricity. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we have a challenge. A third of Australian emissions are from electricity generation. And we have targets to get that down. In Queensland, we're targeting 50% renewables by the year 2030. So we're a long way away from getting our electricity generation down. And what we can do with ethanol is that something we can do today with the existing infrastructure to address the existing vehicles on the road. And I can certainly see internal combustion engine vehicles being on the road 2040 onwards up to 2050. The reality is, even when we reach the point when you can't buy a gasoline vehicle anymore, there are 15 million vehicles on Australian roads, just passenger vehicles, and we only sell 1 million a year. So it will take 15 years before most of the Australian fleet is converted, once that's the only vehicle you can sell. So it is a very long time frame, and I think there is a long-term future for 20 to 30 years easily with lignocellulosic ethanol and potentially beyond.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, sorry. I actually had a related here question directed, I think, towards Chris, and that is, how likely will the USA meet Biden's 50% plans for EV cars in 2030?
Well, I think it's important to note that was a goal and not necessarily a binding commitment. I think, in fact, testifying at a hearing tomorrow, and EPA has estimated that under their current proposed standards, they expect to get to 8% electric vehicle penetration, 8% of sales by 2026, by 2026. So that would mean an additional 42% over 4 years, which, would be a substantial jump. Again, I think it goes to what I said during my presentation and what Keith just reiterated. If you want to get serious about decarbonization, liquid fuels and the internal combustion engine are going to be on the roads for decades to come. Keith talked about the Australian fleet. We have roughly 260 million light duty vehicles here in the US. And electric vehicle or zero emission vehicles are a very small piece of that pie. And if people hold on to vehicles for, let's say, 8 to 10 years, and people are buying 98% liquid fuels next year and the year after, the same cycle continues on. And so you cannot rely solely. I mean, again, I think as any of these alternative technologies flourish, I think that, we're okay with that. But in order to capture greenhouse gas benefits, you have to do something with the fuel today that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, as well as improve air quality and reduce some of the toxic emissions as well.
Very good. I have another question here. This one is directed directly to Dr. Rex, and it basically says, what difficulties do you face when applying biological law? What is the role of the state in supporting the roadmap?
Yeah, so sorry, can you please repeat the question?
What difficulties do you face when applying biological law? I'm hoping you understand that better than I do, what the question means. Do you have biological laws in the Philippines? And what role of the state is there supporting for your ethanol rollout? What sort of state support is there?
Well, we have a law in place, and we have the National Biofuels Board bioenergy plan that projects the increase of bioethanol blending from 5% to 10% and supposedly 20% starting 2020. But in our assessment, and it's the reality in the country, there are two basic problems. Big one, the lack of feedstock, because we lack needed tonnage of sugarcane as well as sugarcane molasses, and the price itself. People are comparing the local ethanol price and that imported ethanol. And we feel that there is only one way to address this issue, both the lack of feedstock and the high price, is to do the breeding intensive and comprehensive breeding program for the both sugar industry and for the ethanol industry to come up with the needed tonnage of sugarcane and sugarcane molasses. The government is, of course, helping us, but from the university perspective, we need more funds for research and development and put really focus on the feedstock development for biofuels, because we have a different program for bioethanol. For biodiesel. So.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rex. Have a two-part question coming up here. And the first is to Bhavisha and Keith, and that is it possible that blending of ethanol may reduce the price of gasoline?
I think it certainly could with time. The difficulty with the existing plants is they're not operating at full capacity and they're not gaining the benefit of economy of scale. I think as we develop more plants and get a wider diversity of feedstocks, then the price will come down, and we have a very large variation in our petrol price. It increases by 30-40% depending on the day of the month, depending on world conditions. And I think there's an opportunity for ethanol to be a lot more reliably priced product. When we're dealing with finished crops, we are subject to world prices, and there are variations with finished crops. But when we're dealing with biomass, of which we are fortunately in a position that we have a lot of biomass feedstocks, these are very reliable and are not so much subject to world pricing in terms of commodities. So I think we are in a position where we could be very competitively priced, and certainly sugar, even sugar as a feedstock, could be very competitively priced. If you were to take the price of sugarcane off the field and take that sugarcane, instead of developing sugar, which we struggle to sell, to turn it into ethanol as a straight feedstock at the commercial going rate for selling sugarcane off a field, it comes out to around about 40 to 50 cents a litre. And that's just straight sugarcane. If you're talking about bagasse, the bagasse and the other biomass has even a lower price in terms of its value, because it doesn't have a lot of alternative uses. So I think there are opportunities to actually reduce the price of petrol over time with the use of ethanol.
Very good. And the second part of that question, it relates to Dr. Rex. In the Philippines, you're moving, or you've got a mandate of E20. How does that work with cars that might only have a manufacturer warranty for E10, for example? I think that's what the question's asking.
We propose actually the vehicle testing to test the compatibility of vehicle at higher blending. We visited US, and we have seen in different pump stations that they have freely optional, the E15. So in this testing of vehicles compatibility, we will have three blendings, the E10, E15, and E20. Although the Philippine Energy Plan states only E20 for 2020, we tried to see what would happen if we will try testing the vehicles with E15, as we have witnessed in the US. So we believe that there should be really a comprehensive test of vehicles to convince the public, the general public, that indeed there will be no negative effect on their engines, and as well as the car manufacturing to continuously provide the warranty of the vehicles sold in the country.
Okay, thanks very much. Good answer. So moving on, a question here, I believe this is for Chris. Was consumer acceptance of ethanol easy in the US? do you suspect there will be consumer pushback in Australia? And if so, how best do we educate around this?
I mean, I think it's certainly taken some education, but I think today, E10 ethanol blended fuel is the gasoline that we have today nationwide. We were hit certainly by a number of our critics, less so the consumer at large and more so those who wanted to, keep ethanol out of the fuel market or, maintain a market for themselves. So we saw numerous claims that we've had to debunk, be it food versus fuel, or land use change, or that various higher blends would hurt engines, and frankly, the experience just hasn't been there. I mean, we've driven. I'll use E15 as an example. Testing was done, 86 vehicles, 6 million miles before it was approved. We've now run 25 billion consumer miles without an engine problem. I showed a slide earlier on land use change. I mean, we are planning basically the same amount of acreage as we did, 80 to 90 years ago. Just innovation with agriculture. So I think it's more fighting back some of the claims of opponents, and debunking some of the myths that are out there. As opposed to consumer acceptance. I think consumers have been largely supportive of ethanol as they've seen prices reduced at the pump. And those who are close to, biorefineries and certainly in farm communities, they understand the impact it's had on their demand and on the rural economy as well.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question here for Keith and Bhavisha. And let me just put it up for you. So basically it's around this BTX levels. And the question is, by diluting, can you actually take all the BTX out and replace it with ethanol? That's the question. Is there a technical impediment to doing that?
You still have to maintain the appropriate qualities of the fuel to meet the fuel specification. So the balance of the makeup of the petrol still has to comply with the specification. So you can't just go pure ethanol and meet the fuel standard. You've got to stay within the Australian fuel specification. But there is no reason why you can take out more aromatics. Already South Korea and the USA are down to 25%. We're at 42 right now. We could go a lot further than 35 by using ethanol. The only barrier to doing that is the fuel standard specification. And most of the countries around the world who have successful ethanol industries have utilized their fuel standard specification as a vehicle to get there by oxygenate mandates, or making it a requirement that the fuel standard includes products such as ethanol to actually achieve greenhouse gas reductions.
Thanks, Keith. Another question around biofuels usage, sort of medium term, and it is biofuels usage is typically driven by government policy or mandate. Aside from compliance, what are the incentive or benefits that fuel producers can focus on to motivate customers to take up biofuels? I guess that I'd open that to everyone. Maybe put you on the spot, Chris, if you have a view on that question.
Sure. I mean, I think, yes, we've certainly had policies that have driven investment in biofuels. And today we are looking at low carbon policies that are really more performance-based standards. They don't specify biofuels. But what we've seen is that, ethanol, as we've seen in California in particular, ethanol, was a main driver in getting low carbon fuel credits. Additionally, our refiners on the market side, our refineries have changed from producing a finished gasoline to basically producing a gasoline feedstock. A bob is what it's called. A bob is then added with 10% ethanol to make a finished gasoline. So it's helped refiners reduce their cost as well, as really an octane component. So I talked about consumer benefits, but on the market side, it's helped refiners maximize their production and really optimize around a 10% blend. And then on the policy side, again, I think as we look towards decarbonization, there's a real opportunity here for low carbon biofuels like ethanol to really drive some of the credits and some of these performance-based standards.
Okay. Dr. Rex, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Nothing more to add with my presentation.
Bhavisha, anything you'd like to add, or Keith?
No,
I think it's go on, Bhavisha. But yeah, I think incentives are one way to encourage people to adopt more ethanol in their products in terms of low carbon targets. The systems in the US have been very, very successful in encouraging biofuels to the point where we send very substantial amount of our tallow to Singapore, which is then turned into renewable diesel, which is then sold to America. And it isn't used for that similar purpose in Australia, which is a little bit sad, but it shows how a system that is effective can actually encourage the market in the USA to even use biomass or byproducts from Australia. So essentially, even in Europe, nearly 2 million tonnes of our canola is sent to Europe and processed for biodiesel. So there is opportunity. We're already supplying biofuel feedstocks to the world out of Australia, and there is opportunity if we can get our policy framework correct to use those feedstocks for employing Australians to create jobs in Australia rather than sending those feedstocks overseas.
Okay, very good. I do have another question. This one's actually in 3 parts. So the first part is a challenge to you, Bhavisha. Basically saying, I think you mentioned a capital cost of 120 million US dollars for 100 million 2G ethanol plant. Looking for a reference, so far as the question is concerned, I think the CapEx might be about twice that number. Is there anything you can answer about that?
Yeah, so that number that was quoted is actually in Australian dollars. So in essence, we're looking at approximately 230 million for a 62.5 to 63 million litre 2G plant, and that would be the Clariant Romanian plant that's currently underway. Our references for 1G or grain ethanol plants comes from Dalby Biorefinery as an example, from a construction and typical capital cost perspective. That would be 10 years old, but we're looking at in the order of 150 million for a 100 million litre plant. And once again, Keith may have some commentary on Dalby specifically. He was the lead engineer on the construction and design of that project, so he may have some insight into that.
Yeah, so just on the Dalby plant that was commissioned in 2009, it was a 76 million litre a year per plant, and the construction cost in Australian dollars as of 2009 was 100 million Australian dollars.
So about 70 million US, yeah?
Yep.
Yep. Very good. The second part of the question is directed to you, Dr. Rex. Are there any plans in the Philippines for 2G ethanol to be produced?
We have a pilot plant here being run, but let me share to you. About 10 years ago, I was the lead personnel or staff of UPLB who conducted the feasibility study of 2G. The numbers that we got is almost the same as the projected price of Australia at $2 per liter. We are having about $1.5 per liter of cellulosic ethanol if produced 10 years ago in the country. Other than that, we have not pursued a commercial scale because in our feasibility study, it could not compete with the sugar-based or molasses-based ethanol production in the country.
Okay, very good, thank you. And the third part of the question is probably one of my favorite questions people ask about ethanol is, eventually ethanol fuel market's going to get reduced through EVs, which we can all argue about whether that's true or not. Is there any direction where the future ethanol could be utilized, for example, biochemicals, etc.? So I'll open that to the floor. Who would like to answer that?
Sure, I'll take it. The short answer is yes. I mean, look, our producers are always looking to expand markets. We are having a very active discussion today in the United States about sustainable aviation fuel, and ethanol as a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel. We talked about this a little bit earlier. It's important that you get the policy right. You can't just turn a switch at an ethanol plant and go from making fuel ethanol and just go straight to jet fuel. I mean, there are a lot of technical components there. There are a lot of different things to do, but it's certainly a very active discussion and something that our producers are looking at very closely. Unfortunately during COVID, we saw fuel demand here in the U.S. cut in half. So our producers, went straight into the hand sanitizer market. And so we're able, again, the volume's not the same, but a number of plants not only did it sort of on an emergency basis, but a number of plants actually made some innovations at their plant so that they could continue to access that market, ongoing, and made some real innovations and upgrades at their plants to continue to access sort of the industrial and pharmaceutical grade alcohol. We have other plants that look at, distilled spirits, and biochemicals is certainly something that folks are talking about quite a bit. The other thing, and we probably don't talk about enough of, is that we just take the starch from, corn or grain sorghum. The rest goes towards, feed and fiber. And part of that, there's been a very robust debate about the role of protein. And so a lot of our plants are looking at, what they can do on the distiller's grain side, sort of the portion left over after using the starch, and how we can continue to supply that market. So certainly a very, very robust discussion that we're having amongst our membership and amongst the U.S. biorefineries about what some of those future market opportunities may be.
I think the sustainable aviation fuel is a very substantial market into the future. The reality is that there is no alternative that's viable in the foreseeable future for aviation in terms of non-liquid fuels. The average lifespan of a jet is like 20 to 30 years. They are a $300 million purchase. They're not something that will be changed every year or every 5 years like a car. And the size of the jet fuel market, all considering the downturn because of COVID, but in Australia, up until 2019, the aviation market has been growing very quickly. And we've already done trials at Brisbane Airport where Virgin brought across some alcohol to jet fuel from Gevo into Australia and trialed that through the Brisbane Airport. So alcohol to jet fuel technology retrofits very easily to existing ethanol technology. You can either, and Gevo are not the only one, LanzaJet have technology to take it from ethanol to jet fuel. It's approved for 50% direct blending right now. So you can put it in the same tank at up to 50% and it's certified ready to go. So that technology is working. There is a growing market for sustainable aviation fuel with time. And realistically, I think it's going to be 20 plus years before the battery electric vehicles really dominate the market. But as that starts to grow, there's still going to be a very large market for aviation, for instance. And there are readily available technologies you can pop onto the back of a conventional ethanol plant to actually turn that into value-added products, whether it be SAF or chemicals or other uses.
I'm on mute. Sorry. Good. Anyone else like to comment on that at all? Or are we good?
Yeah, I would just like to touch on what Chris and Keith said. So with a conventional ethanol plant, the opportunities are endless. And the reason I say this is because with implementation of innovation, and by innovation, we're talking biojet fuel, so front-end manipulation of a typical plant. But there all are other possibilities. So production of potable ethanol streams from an existing ethanol facility, the chemical production, fusel oil use for perfumes, and it's really an all-encompassing type scenario where, depending on what the demand is, the plant could be manipulated and turned down to produce the value-add products that the consumer is after.
Very good. Any other comments? Okay, so time to put your crystal ball out in front of you. Question here about 2G ethanol and the price it can drop to. They're talking about $0.2 in US. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I guess I'd ask the question, how low do you think the price of 2G ethanol can go? And what do you see as the most favorable feedstock? And maybe start with you, Lavisha.
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on the fact that the plants that we're seeing at the moment, in order for that capital cost to reduce, the maturity of the technology and the commercial readiness needs to increase. So the more confident the consumer becomes and the more confident we become in the technology, that's when we can sort of look at the pricing dropping. But the prediction of the $0.2 by the 2030 mark, in essence, needs to be validated. And so there is a period of time where the likes of the Clariant mills and the work that the Prages of the world are busy with, those plants need to move through the train of pilot scale demonstration, moving up to commercial to understand exactly what the bottlenecks may be.
Yeah, I think what the debate we're having here in the U.S. is, and we do have 2G plants. We have some that have started with corn stover, others with kernel fiber from corn and sorghum. But I also wouldn't rule out sort of a first generation plant doing things to innovate to lower their carbon intensity score. Today's starch ethanol plant, again, with sort of readily made technologies, a lot about carbon sequestration, a lot about improvements in agriculture, can actually get to a point where its carbon intensity score is on par with certain cellulosic biofuels. So you're kind of blurring the lines between first and second generation. But again, there's certainly interest in other feedstocks as well. People are looking at wood waste, and other types of biomass. But again, I think the debate we're having on carbon and the drive towards lower greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's important not to just skip over first generation and what they can do to lower carbon intensity as well.
I think that's a very cost-effective way to develop the lignocellulosic fuels. Like, I think it is very significant that people like Clariant are building commercial scale cellulosic plants right now, and that plant in Romania is almost ready for commissioning. There's also plants under construction in India and other places at commercial scale, so it is notable. But over time, those plants need to get a couple of years under their belt to get a bit of a track record to demonstrate they are working reliably at scale. But the opportunity is out there for first generation plants to diversify and reduce their costs by implementing lignocellulosic technology as a front-end alternative. So a typical plant running sorghum or corn could probably halve the amount of corn acreage they need to, or sorghum acreage they need to harvest, if they were to also use the biomass straw that was available off those crops to actually process that as side by side with the grain itself. So you could actually reduce the footprint and reduce the cost of these plants in terms of their feedstocks by diversifying the feed streams to actually make them more cost effective, and also reduces the commercial risk adopting some of these newer technologies to actually get them working side by side with first generation technology. So it's not just you have to go out cold and build a second gen plant from scratch, although this is happening in a number of places around the world now, which is significant. But also you can utilize those first generation plants to make them have a better footprint and help them commercially by reducing their feedstock costs and diversifying the streams through the plant, and then making products that are value add.
Very good. Dr. Rex, did you want to say something?
Yeah, in the Philippine setting, the only viable and competitive feedstock alternative to sugarcane is sweet sorghum. We harvest it's sweet sorghum. We harvest the juice with high bricks compared to grain sorghum or energy sorghum, and we also harvest the grains for feed production. And we've been doing this for more than a decade, starting from the laboratory to agronomic validation and adaptability feasibility studies. And I could see that in terms of increasing farmers' income and competitive in terms of pricing with sugarcane or sugarcane molasses, it's sweet sorghum for the Philippines.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here, starts with a statement and then a two-part question. So the first part is to say that corn productivity, very, very impressive. Seems like over the same period, there hasn't been the same sort of productivity gain in sugarcane. So I guess the question's about how did the US achieve those gains in the corn? Was it GM breeding? How was that achieved? Is, I guess, the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of things. Certainly, improvement in seed technology is part of that. I would also add precision agriculture. You know, the use of GPS technology in today's planters, today's tractors. You're able to plant more in tighter rows. You know, a variety of things over the last 60 to 70 years. And it continues to improve. I mean, the rows get tighter and tighter. Water use is down, fertilizer use is down, energy use is down by farmers. I mean, they're just able to do more, do things more efficiently. And so that has helped improve yield. And so that's what we continue to see. It continues to be a trend.
Okay, very good. And the second part of the question is directed to Visha and Keith, basically says, with the lack of enforcement of mandates in Australia in the RET, why would investors ever invest in Australia? I guess is what the question is.
I certainly think the market needs certainty as far as being able to sell the product that they manufacture. And Australia is one of the few countries in the world that adopts a state-based mandate as a target. Most countries in the world have a federal government-driven, quite often fuel specification-driven drive or incentive system with low-carbon fuel credits to drive the market and give them incentives to actually introduce or use more ethanol in their fuels. And I think that's one of the challenges for Australia, because if it comes down to making sure the product's available for everybody to use. In Australia right now, the latest surveys indicated about half of our dispensers in New South Wales and Queensland have E10. Interestingly, E10 outsells 95 and 98 fuels in Australia independently, in Queensland and New South Wales, despite only being available to half the customers. So it's not necessarily the customers not buying it. Half the customers don't have the choice. But there are a lot of factors in terms of making it available and attractive to the customers, and also what fuel blends. At the moment in Australia, it's largely only regular unleaded petrol that has ethanol in it. There's very little premium fuels in Australia that have ethanol in it, despite the fact virtually every car suitable for premium fuels could handle 10% ethanol very comfortably. So I think that is one of the challenges for Australia, that the regulatory environment has to provide an incentive for ethanol to be made available to consumers, and a very effective way to do that would be via the fuel specification, but that can only be done federally. But that's interestingly probably the most successful driver internationally for those countries with a successful ethanol industry, because you can't build a ethanol plant without a long-term offtake strategy in place, and that's the most critical thing for the growth of the industry here.
Okay. Anyone else want to make a comment at all there? Visha?
No, that was well covered. Thank you.
Very good. Next question, a little bit more about compatibility of cars that are on the road. So all cars are compatible with E10, but this question asked basically, if we move to E20, what sort of policies are going to be needed to get implementation of E20, that is, cars that can actually use it, and what do you do with the current cars on the road? And I think that's I think there's a question, part of that question is about in the Philippines, data will show more old car models versus the flexi cars are on the road. So I'll open that to the floor. Maybe Dr. Rex. Oh, sorry, go
well,
ahead, Chris.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I can talk about our experience here. And part of it, and Keith touched a little bit on sort of fuel specifications. Every time we add or we increase the ethanol percentage, we have to actually request that from our federal government. And in order to do, so with E15, we had to request, it was actually what Growth Energy did, request that we increase the ability to add 15%, not require, but add. And so as part of that, we had to go through pretty thorough testing on vehicles that was done by some of our Department of Energy national labs. There's been a lot of research outside of that to show that, you know, ethanol blended fuels have not been a concern for engine compatibility and have actually shown improvements in air quality and tailpipe emissions. But part of it, usually, and certainly from the United States perspective, is that, you know, we have a regulatory system where we have to kind of go through to prove it out. Again, you know, with E15, we heard some of the criticisms that, well, you know, you're approving the fuel for cars that weren't necessarily made for it. You know, we've done now 25 billion consumer miles on E15 and not a single engine issue. And that was after 6 million miles of testing. So a lot of the compatibility claims tend to come from critics rather than sort of grounded in actual research. And so that's where what we've seen. And again, I think as we move to higher blends, there's a lot of research out there, particularly on a higher octane mid-level blend, to show that it can work.
Okay, very good. Did anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to touch on what Chris has said. And so with our report and some of the research that we have done, just aligning with vehicle compatibility, what was key for us is that even though the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industry did publish some data to talk about vehicle compatibility at the varying ethanol blend rates, there's still information lacking. And I must agree with Chris that unless that's buttoned down, this is open to critics rather than an educated assumption or information that's being published even to the user, the end user.
I think it's important to note too that Australia does not have a vehicle manufacturing industry anymore. All our vehicles are imported, and a lot of the work in the USA is transportable, and the work that's been done overseas to verify vehicle performance, because we're using the same vehicles virtually as what are on the roads of the USA and other countries. We don't manufacture our own custom vehicles anymore. So a lot of this work is transferable and is very important in terms of the adoption of ethanol in Australia.
Very good. Now we just have 5 minutes left, so I think we've got time for 2 more questions. There's been an awful lot of questions we've missed just because there's so many questions here. So I'm trying to pick a couple of last ones, and I thought an interesting one was, and this is for Chris. What is it about California or the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard and associated incentive schemes that seems to be driving people to take up biodiesel rather than ethanol? Because ethanol has been relatively static, biodiesel's going up, of course.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there are actually a couple different answers. So California is one of the 2 remaining states that has not yet approved E15. So they are capped at a 10% ethanol blend. So it gets harder and harder to generate credits from ethanol in California if you're not able to expand your ethanol blend. You can also sell E85 to flex fuel vehicles in California, and we've seen that increase substantially as well. So we think approval of E15 in California is critical, and we think that will certainly continue to drive increasing percentages of ethanol there. I will say on the renewable diesel side, I mean, part of it too is renewable diesel is a drop-in fuel that can be used, 100% as opposed to a smaller blend with ethanol. And I think the other thing not to ignore, and probably it might actually be one of the most important reasons, many of the refiners have put their own investments in renewable diesel. And so they've had a tendency to favor some of their own technology. And so we're starting to see that take off more and more here as well. And certainly, I mean, California is a massive market for all fuels, but they also have a large diesel market in addition to the gasoline market.
Very good, thanks for that. And look, and the final question, bit of a techie question, I think probably for Keith. Ethanol and methanol seem to give similar octane enhancements. Are there any drawbacks to methanol, and what's the key difference between methanol and ethanol?
Well, I think primarily methanol has a limitation right now, as it's not allowed to be at significant percentages under the Australian fuel standard. The only methanol allowed is 0.5% in any ethanol that is blended up to 10% in the fuel standard. So whilst you can have up to 10% ethanol in Australian fuel under the fuel specification, there is no spec right near for methanol today. So that would need to go through government approval to be added. In terms of the two different products, methanol does have some different attributes to ethanol. Methanol, for instance, is much more toxic, does have more effects on human health, and therefore would need to be treated differently, but it doesn't necessarily prohibit it from being used. It is true that it has a similar octane benefit, but I think fundamentally the ability to manufacture it sustainably, the ethanol industry has much better existing facility and proven history of sustainable manufacturing from biosources, and the fact that it's already established as a approved additive for petrol or part of the petrol blend makes it much easier to implement. So there's a lot more work to get methanol approved and established as a alternate octane enhancer.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll call it quits there. I think you managed to answer an awful lot of questions. And I think we got most of the questions, not all, but most questions were able to be asked and I think answered really, really well. So look, I know we're not in a live, so no one can clap or anything, but I certainly appreciate the effort you guys have come to and the good answers you've been able to give. So I will draw the question and answer session to an end. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we have come to the end of this journey here this morning. I want to thank all of our speakers and presenters this morning. All the presentations will remain active in the next few weeks here at the Attendee Hub. Additionally, an email will be sent out to everyone who registered for this webinar to access the PowerPoint slides later today. We're also gathering all the questions. There was an overwhelming amount of questions that came in. We want to make sure that we download that, and we're going to try our best to follow up with each of you that asked a question if you've registered accordingly via your email. I want to take this time to specifically and more importantly recognize our partners, Bioenergy Australia and Manildra. Without you, this would have not been possible. So we're certainly grateful for your partnership and your support. But more importantly, I want to thank you, our attendees, for connecting to this ethanol webinar on the decarbonization of the transport fuel in the bioeconomy. Thanks again. Stay safe and stay strong, everyone.